Howdy, ESSM 406. In this brief lecture, I want to talk about some of the dangers in this class. The first danger that I see is what I call the rush to judgment. This is something that I believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence, is increasing in our society. We live in a very politically polarized society, and this is a class in part about politics. And in part because of the predominance of online news, in part for other reasons that I admit I don't understand very well, we are becoming a society in which people rush to make judgments about things that are going on. We have a 24-hour news cycle. The news cycle is always dominated by the latest scandal. And when we go online, look for news, or for that matter, if we watch TV news or listen to radio news, any news source, there's a lot of research showing that we tend to look for news that confirms what we already think about the world. Furthermore, we tend to have communities of friends and colleagues who have similar opinions as us. We tend to rush in, we see a new thing, and we think, oh, we can understand this based on the past. And there's even research showing that when people are confronted with information, knowledge that conflicts their beliefs, they tend to get stronger in their beliefs. So for example, simple example, there's some people who believe that the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center were some kind of conspiracy, an inside job, weren't done by Al-Qaeda, what have you. There's been research done showing that people who believe this, if you show them evidence that it was in fact done by Al-Qaeda terrorists, you increase their certainty that there was a conspiracy. You become part of the conspiracy to them. And actually, this is not, I mean, those are conspiracy theorists. Maybe conspiracy theorists are a little bit crazy, but we actually have evidence that we all behave this way around issues that we care about. So there's a rush to judgment. And in this class, we want to avoid that. This is a class about analysis. This is a class about collecting evidence and about careful argumentation. In this class, my expectation is that none of you should express an opinion about the topics you're studying for this class until the end of the class. First, you have to do analysis. So briefly, another example. Last year, I had some students who chose to study some potential housing developments that are going to go in next to the world's largest bat cave, which is outside of San Antonio. And one of the students in her first essay said, I want to study this, right? Your first assignment is you have to create a proposal of why you want to study. And she said, I want to study this because this needs to be stopped. I don't want you to do that. Now, if that's what motivates you, if you're really excited about a topic because you're involved in a campaign to stop something, I don't have a problem with that. But for the purpose of this class, in fact, I support that. I support people being politically active, committed, and engaged. But for the purpose of this class, in your writing, I want you to do the analysis first. Tell me what's going on. Why is there a conflict here? What are the different opinions? Why do people have those opinions? And then we'll do some analysis later in the class. What are the underlying causes of this environmental problem? And then once you've done that, I want you to take a stand. I want you to say in your final essay what you believe should happen and why, based on the analysis that you've done. But we're not going to rush in there. We're not going to go in there having already formed our opinions and make a statement. Second danger, and I'm going to talk about a couple things that relate to each other, but I say this, confusing today's policies and politics with kind of a permanent state of things. And this tends to come up when people talk about modern political parties, which we have some emotional identification with. We have actually done research showing that who people vote for is actually an emotional attachment. It's not just an analytic process of what party we agree with. There's a lot of research showing that people often vote for parties that they don't agree with because they think they agree with them, but they don't actually know what that party stands for. And I've even experienced that myself, where I thought I was voting for certain things, for voting for a certain political party or a certain set of beliefs. And then when I looked more closely, I realized that wasn't actually what these people stood for. I want to give you a very specific example of this that's very relevant for this class. There's a tendency today to associate the Democratic Party with the mainstream environmental movement, and the Republican Party either with what's sometimes called the anti-environmental movement, or sometimes with certain forms of free market environmentalism, as it's known. We'll talk a little bit more about what those mean. But you need to be very careful with this because of a couple reasons. The first reason is this is a modern phenomenon. In fact, also, the states that we think of being associated with different political parties and being associated with being so-called conservative and so-called liberal are very recent phenomena. Most of the US's environmental laws were signed into law by Richard Nixon, who also created the Environmental Policy Act. Now, as you know, at that time, Richard Nixon was a leading conservative, right? So he was a Republican, he was a conservative, and he created most of our environmental laws, played an important role in the creation. Furthermore, he was from what at that time was the leading conservative state in the United States, which produced our two most important modern conservative presidents, Nixon and Reagan. That state, of course, was California, which we now associate very strongly with the Democratic Party and being liberal. And it's worth remembering also that Nixon replaced the most liberal president, arguably in American history, who was from a leading Democrat state. That was Texas. That was Lyndon Johnson. So we shouldn't confuse Texas conservatives, Democrats. We should try to actually be analytical. What do these people stand for? Why do they stand for it? How did they come into power? There's a history to this in our country. We also don't want to take for granted some of the statements and assumptions that political actors make. We want to do the analysis. Again, this goes back to my first point. I've had students who've written essays where they take very literally some of the critiques of, say, President Obama right now about the development of the Keystone Pipeline and some critiques that they've heard on, say, some news shows. And I've actually been able to show those students that oftentimes the things that they've heard on those news shows are factually incorrect about what President Obama is actually saying and actually doing. So we want to be very careful about taking many of these news sources. Many of our news sources today are highly partisan. We want to be critical of what they're saying. Partisan news sources, Fox News is extremely conservative, often very biased. Say the Huffington Post, quite liberal, often quite biased, etc. Finally, I think it's very important that we think about separating the analytic tools that we're using to analyze policies, the analytic tools that we're using to analyze politics, and the tactics and political strategies of political actors. Political actors often say things that aren't quite what they mean. They often obfuscate. They often try to hide things, hide what they mean, hide what they're doing behind rhetoric. We want to use some analytic tools. We want to do careful research to get beyond those simplified versions. That's all today. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy writing your papers, and if you have any questions, please contact me or the TAs.